I want to start by talking about the writer, the text type, the audience, and the purpose, because that information is going to be really important in helping us explore how and why the text is crafted the way that it is. Now, the information that Edexcel give you about the writer Kari Herbert at the beginning of the text is significant by telling us that she lived amongst the Inuit people as a child, but doesn't any longer and is now revisiting. It gives us a sense of the perspective that she is coming from. And if you've seen my videos on the other Edexcel texts, you'll have heard me talk a lot about the insider-outsider perspective. And what that means is how much information does the writer personally hold about the topic that they're writing about. And Kari Herbert is an interesting case because she is in a way simultaneously an insider and an outsider. She is an insider because she was raised amongst Inuit people, so she has that insider understanding of the culture. That being said, she is also an outsider because she hasn't been with this community for a really long time. She's going back to visit them. And in this text, she is quite literally an outside observer of something that is happening. So there is also an element of her observing a culture external to herself and reflecting on it, making a comment about it. The audience to this text is almost certainly an outsider to it though, because the statistical odds of them being Inuit people are incredibly small. So by and large, she is writing for an outsider perspective. So she needs to use her insider knowledge and understanding of the culture in order to help the outsider audience, most likely Western, just because of it being a book published first in Britain by a British person and being written in the English language. She needs to help her audience understand this culture. At the same time, she is also in a similar position to her audience. There is a similarity there because just as she is observing this hunt happening, her recreation of this hunt gives us the ability to observe this hunt happening and reflect on its significance and what we think and feel about it. So there is an element in the purpose, not just of her trying to entertain, because that's a given with any good writing, but also her trying to explain a culture to her audience, and perhaps an element of trying to argue a case as well, because what we see in this text is essentially her exploring that conflict between the need for the Inuit people to hunt versus the desire to protect the narwhal creatures. And so part of what she's doing, if we take those three elements of writer, audience, and purpose and tie them all together, she has at some point in her life observed this hunt and had that inner conflict between the need to hunt versus the desire to protect these animals. And she is now trying to almost recreate that dilemma for our audience, in the sense that she wants the audience to understand where her conflict came from, why she was feeling that conflict, and perhaps argue the case for which side she fell on and on what she ultimately felt. And I'll go into more detail on what she ultimately felt when we actually get into the meat of the text. I will just say now, though, that I think the last paragraph of this text is where we really see the coda. A coda is a sort of final summary to an argument. And I think that's where she has her coda for her audience on her stance of, like, you know, which side of the conflict she's rested on, the Inuit people's need to hunt versus the desire to protect, or the need to protect, the narwhals. The only other thing I would add in terms of text type and what this adds to it is the fact that it's a memoir. That is the vehicle by which she is able to recreate her memories in order for that Western audience to be able to see it, understand it, reflect on it themselves. Memoir in particular is useful because it is grounded in first-person personal experience, and it allows for a creative blend between the factual of what actually happened in the moment and the subjective creation of the feeling she had when she was there. And we're going to see that a lot in the language of the text, the blending use of fact and her opinion and imagery in order to sort of blend what she knows about Inuit culture, about narwhals, with what she feels. Overall, all of those different aspects about this text come together to create the central sort of argument that pretty much no matter the kind of question you would get for this text, you're most likely going to keep coming back to this point. And that is, as I've already said, this text is exploring the conflict between the fact that she respects and admires both the hunters and the narwhals, and essentially an exploration between survival needs in a hostile environment, like the Arctic, versus animal rights and the need to protect particularly rare, unique animals like narwhals. Before we go into analysing the language structure of this text, I want to talk about what the actual ideas are that we're going to see being presented as we go through. As I've already said, the key thread to this text is the fact that it's exploring the respect and admiration she holds for both the narwhals and the hunters and the conflict between the two. But part of what she does throughout the text is present why she respects and admires each of them. And the reasons are similar and yet different. If we start with the narwhals, she sees them as a unique creature in the animal kingdom. And the reason for that, she's going to present to us the narwhals as being incredibly beautiful, but in an almost otherworldly way. She's going to present them as being something very rare. They are also going to be shown to be very intelligent animals with a level of intelligence that one would expect almost more from human beings, a sociability about them, an awareness about them that is much more like humans than it is like other animals. Another reason she admires them is the fact that they seem to be part of this much bigger, grander natural order of the world. She's going to talk about, the patterns of how the narwhals behave throughout the seasons, the ways that they move together in this sort of a mutual unspoken understanding. They're going to be presented as something very much part of this great big incredible world, natural world that exists outside of human existence. And all of that comes together to make them awe-inspiring for her. With the hunters, it's similar and yet different. So with the hunters, she admires their skill and their tenacity. This is almost like, this is the idea that would be similar to the beauty and intelligence of the narwhals. It's these traits that they possess that she really admires. And the skill and tenacity is not just in hunting narwhals, but also in surviving in an environment as hostile as the Arctic. That also links back to the cultural heritage that she has massive respect for, the Inuit culture and how they go about living in the Arctic world. She has a great admiration and respect for that, and she's going to present this culture to us as being, ancient and passed down and really important. And then all of that is going to combine to make the Inuit hunters awe-inspiring to her. So both hunters and narwhals come to be seen by her as awe-inspiring, but for similar and yet different reasons. So this first paragraph of the text is where we get our first lot of presenting the narwhals. Now, as a whole, the big technique I'm going to be talking about here is imagery. The imagery of the narwhals and the hunters that Herbert creates with where she was when the hunt began. But there are some specific lines we want to zoom in on. We've got this line, the plumes of spray from the narwhal catching the light in a spectral play of colour. There's a few things we can say about this. The first is obviously the beauty of the image that is created here of the narwhals. What's interesting about this image though is that the first way that you see the narwhals is not seeing the narwhals themselves, but is the water that they blow out. I don't know. Her plumes of spray is a much more beautiful way of phrasing it than blasts water into the air or whatever the technical term is. Point is, you see their actions before you see them. And I think that fact adds to a sense as well of them being quite elusive, because it's like they're difficult to spot within the water. And it's like the fact that you only see that plume of light because it catches the light. It all feels very subtle, easy to miss. And yet, if you do manage to see it, incredibly beautiful. That image of the spectral play of colour also adds to our elusiveness, because spectral is linked to something looking ghostly. It's like on the one hand, you can see it because you've got this play of colour. On the other hand, there's also something like, is it there, is it not there, spectral about it, elusive about it. And I think what that imagery is therefore doing is partly, in addition to presenting the narwhals as beautiful, it's foreshadowing the challenge that the hunters are going to face, trying to catch something that's so elusive. The next image that I want to talk about is this often looking as if they were going to merge, but always slowly, methodically passing each other by. Now the connotations to this movement of the narwhals is very gentle, very soft, very deliberate, purposeful, measured. I've just used a load of different words there that all kind of create the same meaning. Now, if we think about why the writer would want to point out the gentle, measured movements of the narwhals, again, remembering what I said about with a memoir, there's always the fact that there's always a sort of interesting blend whereby the writer is presenting, yes, the facts of what happens, but is also crafting a memory, a subjective memory, in order to put forward a particular viewpoint. So of all the details she could have chosen about the narwhals, these are the details she chose. Why those details? Of all the words she could have chosen to describe the narwhals, these are the words she chose. So even though this is non-fiction, that doesn't mean that this is an unbiased just statement of what occurred. I think it's all serving a wider picture that she wants to present of the narwhals. In this case, if you think about the gentleness and then you juxtapose that with the fact that we as the audience know these narwhals the aim is to hunt them. What it does is create a sympathy for the narwhals because they don't come across as any kind of threat. Similarly, those measured movements, they come across as being very peaceful, and also there's an intelligence there again. There is a sort of instinctive understanding of each other and the world around them. Now, if we take a moment to think about the psychology of human beings and our sort of categories of what we don't mind hunting and what we think is wrong to hunt. Creatures that are peaceful, not a threat to us, and have an instinctive high intelligence, we usually aren't a big fan of killing those ones. And this image of their very deliberate, intelligent movements is quickly juxtaposed with the way that she describes her own movement of scrambling back, which comes across as much more clumsy. So there is a sense there of almost the narwhals having an elegance and a grace to them that's more than at least she possesses, if not all human beings. And she goes on to give some information about the atmosphere of this place. And she talks about it being a glittering kingdom. That image is important in terms of how it presents both the narwhals and the Arctic. The glittering obviously adds to our image of beauty. There is a beauty to both the environment and the narwhals. And it adds to that feel, like we said with the narwhals being elusive, it's of something otherworldly, of something almost magical. So it feels like there is this relationship, this connection between the narwhals and the Arctic environment that they are in. They are both this elusive, magical atmosphere. But there's also, if we think about kingdom in particular and that metaphor, she's trying to create a sense of the grandeur of the environment that they are in. I've just realized it looks like I've spelt that horrifically, so I'm going to rewrite it. But also I think there's a reverence there. Now, reverence means a sort of high level of respect for something, because if you're referring to somewhere as a kingdom, of course, the next logical link is like kings and queens and that highest level of hierarchy. And therefore, it's this feeling of like this environment belongs to something much more important and higher than her. When we combine that with the sort of elegance and grace and beauty that's been suggested about our narwhals, although she doesn't use any royalty imagery in the way she's described them, there is a fittingness there. If you think about kings and queens often evoking images of purposefulness, of being quite elusive, of being beautiful, graceful, elegant, it fits together, doesn't it? Our narwhals don't feel out of place. The image she's created of our narwhals does not feel out of place in a kingdom either. A small detail here as well, that we have our sharp intake of breath. That imagery describing what the writer was doing in the moment is of course about showing how she's feeling about what she's seeing with these narwhals in this Arctic environment. And what she's feeling is a sense of awe-inspired. The beautiful imagery she's creating, she extends as well to the hunters. And that's part of, if we think about her inner conflict, there is a beauty to all of it. The entire sort of Arctic culture that she is witnessing. Because we have this imagery of the evening light turning butter gold, glinting off man and whale and catching the soft billows of smoke from a lone hunter's pipe. That butter gold really creates a richness. And also, if you think about our previous image of our glittering kingdom, gold, glittering kingdom, it all fits to create an atmosphere of something that is very serene, but also very majestic. And just as the light was catching on the narwhal's plumes of spray, so too is it glinting off man. So it really creates, she's repeated that pattern there of creating a close tie between environment and those living in it. The way that they catch each other, glint off each other. The soft billows is a similar image to our like gentle measured movements of our narwhal, isn't it? Because we've got the soft billows being quite similar to the slowly, methodically passing. So she's creating imagery that actually creates a lot of similarity between our narwhals and our hunters, even though they are opposed in purpose right now. I also think there's really something interesting about the way she presents the power in this paragraph. On the one hand, we're told that the hunters were dotted all around the fjord. That image should create a sense of power because they're sort of dominating the landscape. And yet we're told about the lone hunter's pipe, and that word dotted also, it's quite interesting in that it can connote a feeling of something spread out, and yet not dominating because you're sort of too sparse, you're too disconnected. It very much does feel like the ones in control and with the power right now are the narwhal themselves, because they don't know it, but they are what has got everybody's attention. Whereas the hunters feel a little bit more isolated and distant, and the narwhal feel more like a sort of collective power. I'm not fully convinced. I feel like I am onto something there, but I'm not fully convincing myself. So let me know in the comments if you see what I'm saying, and maybe you can even phrase the analysis better than me. Maybe it's also coming from the stillness of the hunters, because we're told even though they could be really close, they never moved. So maybe it's that juxtaposition as well between the stillness of the hunters versus the movement of the narwhals that makes it feel like the narwhals are the ones really taking all of the attention and energy here. The final thing I want to talk about for this paragraph, it comes back again to that idea of the narwhals being elusive, because she tells us the distances are always deceptive, and she fell to wondering if the narwhal existed at all or instead were mischievous tricks of the shifting light. This repeated use of light imagery, we had the narwhal catching the light, we had the evening light, butter gold, we had the mischievous tricks of shifting light. She's simultaneously using light to create a sense of the visual beauty of things, but also the elusiveness as well. Even if we take the references to like glinting as well, everything feels very impermanent. If you think about the quickness of something, actually I would include glittering in that as well, use the wrong color pen. All the references to light are very quick and impermanent, and that therefore create the feel of something being very elusive, as well as very beautiful. So overall in this paragraph, there's a lot going on here. This is really rich linguistically. It's about creating a sense of nature's magnificence, I would say, overall. And structurally, that's important because, of course, it's the very first paragraph of our extract. It's not necessarily the first paragraph of the text as a whole, or even perhaps a chapter, But we can treat it as the first paragraph because it is the first paragraph we've got. And it being the first paragraph we've got, that sort of privileged position of what is foregrounded from the very beginning of the text, Herbert really strongly wants to communicate to us the magnificence of the nature. What she's going to do in the third paragraph, and also actually the fourth as well, is also go over the magnificence of the Inuit culture. And so if we think about her sort of building up to her conflict and her argument, she's essentially got to set up both sides, doesn't she? She's got to present her respect and admiration for the narwhals, the magnificence of the nature of the Arctic and the narwhals, and then she's got to follow that with the sort of magnificence of the Inuit people, and therefore we can see why she has that conflict. I've gotten ahead of myself a little bit though, because this next paragraph does also add to the presentation of the narwhals. Even though it's much shorter, I do want to cover what this has got as well. Now, this paragraph, unlike the paragraph filled with rich imagery in our first one, this second one is pretty much pure fact. However, that doesn't mean it's not adding to the presentation, because she has chosen her facts carefully and she's chosen how to express her facts carefully. The first thing I want to point out are these words that add to the feeling of the narwhals being elusive. So we've got rarely, only, never entering. I would say what we've got here is almost like a semantic field of exclusivity that adds to that feeling of them being unique and elusive, because she's really reinforcing with her facts how difficult it is to manage to see a narwhal. And indeed, she communicates that with her choice of the word fortunate. In summer, the hunters are fortunate to witness the annual return. So she creates connotations there of like privilege. So there's a feeling that the hunters themselves, or she has a respect and admiration for the narwhals and admires what she is able to see. And so too do the Inuit people, because they are the ones who are fortunate to witness this annual return. Speaking of the annual return, what I think that does is add to the feeling of what I was saying about that natural world. It's this feeling of ritual and order that exists whether or not human beings are there to witness it, and adds to that feeling of nature's magnificence. Just as we human beings have our rituals and our processes, so too do animals. And that adds to that feeling of the narwhal's instinctive intelligence there. And I think the reason as well that facts can be quite powerful when she has just covered things in a much more visual imagery way, a much more subjective, metaphorical manner. Coming in with facts helps to add a weight to her presentation of the narwhals. It adds this sense that this is not just her feeling about narwhals. Her feeling of them being elusive is an accurate feeling because it's backed up by the facts of narwhals' behavior. Similarly, the respect and admiration she has for getting to see this unique, majestic moment is supported by the fact that the hunters are fortunate to witness this annual return as well. It's other people get to feel that privilege too. So she's not alone in her feelings. It's supported by the facts. What's interesting about her saying the hunters of Thule are fortunate to witness the annual return, obviously saying something is fortunate is an opinion, not a fact. But what is unclear from the wording is whether it is the Inuit people themselves that are recognizing it as being fortunate and therefore they recognize the privilege of the environment in which they live, or whether it is Herbert with her outsider perspective reflecting on their culture and reflecting on how they get this privilege that most other human beings will never have of getting to witness this return. So it's not clear, is this her insider perspective of knowing that the Inuit people recognize their privilege in what they get to see and the beauty and majesty of it? Or is it her outsider's perspective showing a respect and admiration for this culture and what they get to see? Now we go to our paragraphs where, yes, it is technically still about the narwhal, But actually, the purpose behind this paragraph is about trying to start to make the case for the hunters and why hunting the narwhal is necessary. Again, the entire paragraph is a string of facts, but the way these facts have been strung together, the way they've been expressed, the order they're in, and so on and so forth, is very deliberate on the part of Herbert. So as a whole, I'm pretty much always talking about the technique of facts, but there's a few things about how she expresses these facts that I want us to look a little closer at. The first is that we've got a listing of facts, and across our list are all the different things that the hunters use narwhals for. Now, of course, what that is trying to do is use that list of facts to show how important they are to the hunters, because they're needed in loads of different parts of their lives. It's about food, it's about weapons, it's about warmth, it's about so many different things, and that comes across from the listing of the facts and the range of uses for narwhals within that list. The second thing that shows how important the narwhals are is the way that she's used the semantic field of indispensability. And I'm going to show you the words that would be inside that semantic field. So you've got essential, necessary, only, and valuable. And all of these words really convey how core the narwhals are to the Inuit survival. They cannot do without them. What's interesting is that she follows that semantic field of indispensability with the fact that the tusk seems to have little use for the narwhal itself. Because of course she's contrasting the lack of importance of the tusk to the narwhal to when she's just covered how essential the tusk is to the Inuit people. And what that does is create an empathetic understanding almost of, well, they kind of need it and the narwhal doesn't. We also have a feel throughout this paragraph for the cultural heritage of the Inuit people, because we're told, for centuries they've used the blubber. We're told that it's used as the tusk is used as a central beam for their small ancient dwellings, that it is used to carve their tupilaks. So there's a strong feeling that the narwhal has been tied up inextricably with Inuit culture for a really long time, for centuries. So by the end of this section that's really focused on the narwhals themselves, it's about to shift to the actual hunting, but this creation of the narwhals has foregrounded not only their beauty and majesty in their own right, but how essential they are to the hunters, thereby beginning to create that sense of the conflict between the desire to protect these narwhals for their own right to live and exist versus the survival needs of the Inuit people. Because of course this paragraph also reminds us how hostile the environment is. We're reminded in the facts of a place where it's not possible to grow vegetables or fruit, and the only source of heat and light. That feel of a very hostile environment is also within those facts as well, to remind us of how difficult it is to try and survive. There is no popping to Tesco in this world. Herbert now moves on to describe the hunt itself. And from a writer's standpoint, the challenge she now faces in trying to describe this hunt is she's successfully created for her audience a lot of empathy for the narwhal. So it would be really easy for us to almost view the hunter as an enemy, not like them, be on the side of the narwhals. But of course, part of her goal is trying to create that inner conflict she felt, where she equally respected and admired both sides, she empathized with both sides. So what's interesting about the imagery, because that is the sort of core technique of this paragraph, is the imagery she creates around what the hunt looks like. The core goal of this imagery is creating empathy for the hunters as well. And so we're going to have a look at how she does that. One of the ways is by creating a feeling of community and closeness. So we have this verb of the women being clustered on the knoll of the lookout. And there's in this imagery a real feel of the emotional pull for the women, because we hear about them giving a small gasp or a jump as one of them sees a hunter near a narwhal, and they're focusing on their husband. They're spinning around, when they hear that small gasp or jump. What she's communicating this in the sort of emotion in the atmosphere, she's conveying the tension of the atmosphere, the nerves in there. But specifically, that tension, that nervousness is coming from the care that these women have. And I think we get that because of the constant reminder of the sort of relationships between them. Her phrasing is not necessarily saying hunter, hunter, hunter every time, but actually it's wife, it's husband. The use of that language and the fact that it symbolizes the close romantic relationship between the people doing the hunting and the people watching the hunting, it constantly has in the back of our minds that closeness, that community at the heart of all of this, the love, the care at the heart of all of this. So we're able to empathize a lot more with this than if it was given a much more stark feeling of just like hunter going after narwhals. I also think it's interesting that she describes each wife knowing her husband instinctively, because of course the way she's presented the narwhals, I was talking about that instinctive intelligence that she implies that they have, that connection the narwhals have with the nature around them, with the Arctic, with other narwhals. Essentially, Herbert is creating that same sort of feeling amongst the Inuit people. There is an instinctive connection, closeness between them. And we have, again, more of that semantic field of indispensability of how important things are, because we're told that it's crucial and we're reminded of what was said before about it being a staple part of their diet and bringing much needed extra income. So we're being reminded of the stakes here. And that is part of what increases the tension, is our knowledge of the high stakes, because there's not only a survival pressure about it from the staple diet. That's what the staple diet represents, is the survival. And then the much needed extra income represents the economic pressure. So the stakes feel high because of both survival and economic pressure, as well as just the wider concern that these women have for their loved ones who are doing something quite dangerous. The simile of the vast waterborne game, with the hunters spread like a net around the sound. We've got two different similes going on there. If I start with the vast waterborne game, I think that is about creating a feel of, yes, again, the high stakes like there would be. I don't think it's trying to create a sense of the like playful fun or anything like that. It's more the sort of, that high tension of a crucial championship final kind of vibe, And I think it also creates a feel of the skill involved and the strategy involved in the hunting too. So that's what makes it similar to sort of a sport. And I think the imagery of like a net around the sound also is about the skill and strategy too, because we think of a net as being, it's a traditional item used to catch something. So the fact that the hunters themselves are the net, it very much places the skill of catching something in them. One of the interesting things, if I step back to look more at this paragraph as a whole, one of the interesting things is about it is the way that it creates a sense of the Inuit community, where we've got the women as observers and the hunters as the actors. And yet there isn't a feel of like, the women are just passive watching the men, just as how with the men there's a feeling of like skill and strategy. That description of the women pointing their binoculars in every direction and then watching their progress intently, the women also feel like they're very, very involved in this entire process. Even though it is the hunters going after the narwhal, the way that Herbert has presented it is much more as a community activity, and that is what adds to the feeling of this being like part of their cultural heritage. We have these facts then about the narwhal, and similar as to what we were saying earlier, she's using the facts in order to present this sort of uniqueness and intelligence of the narwhal, because we see behavior that almost feels more in keeping with human beings. The fact that they talk to one another under the water, it's almost anthropomorphic. That means that an animal is being given more like human qualities. It's not zoomorphism, because she's not being metaphorical. the narwhal literally can talk to one another. But in the way that she's phrasing it in a very human-like way. These facts also foreground the challenge that the hunters face in trying to catch the narwhal, because of course she explains that was why the hunters had to sit so very still in the water. The narwhals, even though they are the ones being hunted, are presented as the ones with the power in this situation, because they have, the really keen hearing, the senses and so on. They are the ones who can easily, spot that they're being hunted. There's very much a sense, which is going to be enhanced in our next paragraph, that even though they are the Inuit people are the hunters, they are also the ones who are vulnerable. And that vulnerability, yes, comes from the high stakes of this situation, the fact that they are so dependent on these narwhals for their survival and their economic success. But also, as we're going to see in this next paragraph, just for managing that they're vulnerable in how dangerous it is to try and hunt a narwhal as well. So if we take the imagery of the hunt and identify where that vulnerability is coming from for our hunters, we've got the fact that the narwhal is described as huge, and also that he's in a flimsy kayak. So that juxtaposition between the power of the narwhal as connoted by huge versus the weakness of the human in a flimsy kayak that could easily be capsized and drowned. The fact that he has no rifle, only one harpoon with 2 heads and 1 bladder. It's presented very much as a situation where the human does not have necessarily the tools that would make this a safe and easier catch. That being said, she does present it as being a way of catching narwhals if you have a great deal of skill. For example, we've got this adverb of gently that makes the way the hunter picks up the harpoon feel very precise and deliberate. She's very explicit in the respect and admiration that she holds for the hunter. She literally says it was brave and it inspires respect. Now, she calls it a foolhardy exercise, which actually could be perceived as a negative judgment, but that's not how she uses it. She's flipping that word foolhardy because, of course, it appears foolhardy because of how vulnerable this hunter is. No rifle, only 1 harpoon with 2 heads and 1 bladder. But, of course, what the 1 harpoon with 2 heads and 1 bladder represent is, again, the tradition and the skill behind the hunting. While rifle might symbolize more advanced weaponry, Western weaponry, the harpoon with 2 heads and 1 bladder symbolizes the traditional skill by which they go about hunting narwhals. What's also interesting in this paragraph is the blending across, on the one hand, her presentation of the hunter, her presentation of the narwhal, but how that's also interlaced with her own thoughts and feelings as well, which of course is possible because of this being a memoir. This is as much about how she feels about what's happening as anything else. So while we have this description of what's happening, we get the description of her heart leaping for both hunter and narwhal, and she urged the man on in her head, and yet at the same time her heart also urged the narwhal to dive to leave to survive. So that first one of her heart leaping for both hunter and narwhal, the metaphor of the heart leaping, of course, is about feeling a fear for both sides, because she's recognizing the power and vulnerability of both sides. The hunters have a power that comes from their skill, but ultimately also a vulnerability of, the way in which they hunt and how powerful the narwhal are. The narwhals have a power from their size, from their hearing and other developed senses, but also a vulnerability because they are being hunted. So she's really, there's such a tone of empathy for both. And that is what is creating our inner conflict. And she's able to show that inner conflict through the first person narrative. The other thing I would point out is, again, just the parallelism in the language of I urged the man and urged the narwhal. In both cases, urged has connotations of like a desperation in feeling. She really wants them to survive, but also not the narwhal to survive, but also really wants the hunters to succeed. So that parallelism in using the exact same language to talk about both the man and the narwhal and how she's feeling just again highlights her inner conflict, because of course it's not possible for both sides to equally succeed. One side has to succeed over the other. That triadic structure that she's got there of to dive, to leave, to survive is interesting in the way that the momentum of it creates a real feeling of a plea, an urgency to Inuit of wanting the narwhal to get away. But there also is, of course, an irony in that last one in the list of to survive, because the narwhal succeeding in surviving means the hunter doesn't. It's the hunter who needs to succeed in order to survive. So that irony in that last one in particular really again reinforces where this conflict is coming from, what the real dilemma and challenges of this situation. But of course, we as the reader are only able to pick up on that challenge, that dilemma, because of everything she's done up to this point. Everything she's written up to this point has been very subtly building up the picture of two equal sides, equally worthy, equally admirable, equally awe-inspiring, and the inherent battle for survival, conflicting battle for survival between them. What she therefore does in her last paragraph is make explicit that situation that she's been implicitly feeding through in all the other paragraphs. Similar to what I was saying in the previous paragraph about her use of the first person, this paragraph also is another real big increase in the use of the first person voice. Now, of course, it's first person the entire way through, but she has really increased the amount she's talking about her thoughts and feelings, where before it was very much about the narwhals, it was about the Inuit people. Now it's much, much more right at the end here about her thoughts and feelings on everything that she's seeing, which gives it a very reflective tone towards the end of the text. We've got an interesting semantic field of empathy throughout this paragraph, because she says things like, I understand, I know, true, constantly using language that shows her understanding and appreciation of the situation, reminding us of her sort of insider perspective of the Inuit situation, because she's saying, I understand the harshness of life in the Arctic. I know one cannot afford to be sentimental. She is really understanding of the culture that fits again with that insider perspective. She's also got this interesting little anecdote in here where she says, how can you possibly eat seal? I have been asked over and over again. Now that, of course, is again part of her insider perspective, things she has experienced as a part of from having been in this culture herself. And what's interesting about that anecdote is it's one in which she is being an aspect of her culture is being criticized by an outside voice. So on the one hand, she's sort of recognizing her position ultimately still as an outsider to this Inuit community and their situation, and the issue with being an outsider criticizing a culture. She knows what that is like. She knows the flaws in the outsiders' arguments and the fact that they don't fully understand the situation. And in that sense, I think she's almost preempting the audience reaction to everything she's saying, because remember, our audience are very unlikely to be part of the Inuit community. They're much more likely to be Westerners, outsiders also to this community, and therefore she's sort of preempting their reaction to the narwhal hunting of how could you possibly hunt these amazing creatures, and she's pointing out, she's going through the logical flaws of that kind of attitude, pointing out to the audience via this anecdote that the audience doesn't understand the culture fully in order to understand why they would make this decision. That being said, remember, she kind of knew that from the beginning, because that is the entire reason why she has needed to really communicate the empathy and respect needed for the hunters as well as the narwhals. And actually, if you look at the sort of structure of this paragraph, and imagine this as being her final argument between, is it right to hunt narwhals? They're amazing, intelligent animals, unique in the animal kingdom and so on, versus the hunter's need for them. How much of that paragraph, of that final paragraph, does she spend sort of defending reasons not to hunt narwhals? Basically none. She leaves that argument as implicit because, of course, she knows her audience are already going to know that animal rights argument. What she feels the need to do is to defend the other side, because that is the side that conflicts with Western viewpoint of animal rights. She spends basically this entire paragraph justifying all of the different reasons that the hunters have to hunt narwhals. Even though she begins the paragraph by calling it a dilemma that stayed with her for the whole time, by the time she's actually writing this text, I think she has picked a side, if you will. It's difficult for her. It's emotionally difficult. But look at the final line of the text. Hunting is still an absolute necessity. So that word of absolute creates a real binary here. There is no other option. There is no choice. While, of course, necessity, we've seen this word multiple times throughout the text, is part of that semantic field of indispensability that we've seen. And then the fact that structurally, this is the final line of the text. Again, it might not be the final sentence of the actual book or even an actual chapter, but it's the final sentence you've got. So we get to treat it like it's the final sentence. That being the final sentence, she ends by choosing a side, I think. And she sides with the hunters and recognizes it is difficult because narwhals are amazing, but it has to be done. And if you think about it, big picture, that's not an easy case to make, which is why I say that part of her purpose this whole time, she's had her audience in the back of her head. She knows they aren't going to like this. And so she's like, how can I steer them to my way of thinking by the end? How can I get them by the end of my text to understand the conflict and understand why it isn't as simple to be like, oh, narwhals are amazing. How could you possibly kill them? And how can I help them understand the complexity of this situation? So I think this text is really heavily driven by the influence of who the audience is and how Herbert wants us to, yes, understand the conflict she experienced, but also almost defend her experience because it is so different to what a Western audience might normally think about the hunting of Arctic animals.